So welcome everybody to our second webinar of the Financial History Network. This is the second presentation of our second series. We started last year, and we're very glad to see our community growing, and of course the very high quality presentations that we're having. Today, it is my pleasure to host Aurelius Noble, will be presenting his paper, Business Among Friends, Personal Connections and Client Sharing in Merchant Banking, circa 1900. Aurelius is a third-year PhD candidate in the Department of Economic History at the London School of Economics. His research focuses on the role of community and social capital in banking during the first globalization. He mostly uses quantitative methods, particularly network and demographic analysis, which we'll be seeing today. So the format of the webinar, that Aurelius will have 30 minutes or so to do his presentation, after which we'll have a Q&A session. Ideally, I would ask you to raise your hand to ask your questions, and I'll moderate. We can gather a couple of questions, rounds of 3 or so, depending on how many do we have. Also, if you do not want to turn on your camera and microphone, you can type in your questions in the chat, and I'll be more than happy to read them. So please, no interruptions during the first half, and we'll leave all the questions for the Q&A session. So Aurelius, the floor is yours, and welcome to the Financial History Network.
Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, today I'm going to be presenting this paper, Business Among Friends. It's still a relatively early draft, so I'm really looking forwards to your feedback on sort of the direction I could take this project, as well as any kind of more specific points that you might have. So the idea with this project was really, or with this paper, was to think about the nature of information production in the London money market during the first globalization. And in particular, it was to think about the incentives that information producers might have for producing novel information about borrowers. So some recent papers have been kind of considering this within a sort of relationship banking framework. And the idea here was to try and look at the extent to which merchant banks in particular are developing kind of deep, unique relationships with clients, or conversely, whether they're actually kind of sharing those clients with each other, and that relationship is not as specific as we might otherwise think. And beyond that, it's about thinking where these clients are shared, why these banks might be sharing those clients in particular with each other. So obviously, London was central to global financial markets in this period, and in particular to kind of providing short-term borrowing facilities. And it was in this role that it really connected lenders in London to a huge variety of overseas borrowers who were often kind of relatively small firms, right? And so what this meant was that there were very large information asymmetries between those lenders in London and between borrowers. And so the main instrument kind of circulating the London money market, the Bill of Exchange, we have the sort of intermediary role of the acceptor, who is producing information about those borrowers in order to try and reduce those information asymmetries. And what the kind of impressive characteristic of these bills was that they were extremely liquid and generally considered virtually riskless, despite those information asymmetries. So what we want to think about is how merchant banks, which were sort of the main producers of information in this market, help resolve those asymmetries. And there are a number of reasons why they've been typically thought of as having a particularly advantageous position in that regard, particularly because of their long-standing ties to merchants and kind of merchanting communities overseas. Now, the kind of nature of these relationships and the extent to which the relationships between merchant banks and borrowers was unique is important for a number of reasons. If there was kind of some kind of information sharing or client sharing going on, this presents the risk of kind of free rider problems, which could increase kind of the risk within the system. And it also means that we might think that there's more limited access to capital for smaller firms that don't exist within these areas of kind of cultural specialization of the merchant banks. More generally, we might also think that this would reduce competition in the merchant banking sector in general. Now, the argument that I'm going to try and make today is that the idea of merchant banking as a relatively pure form of relationship banking needs some substantial qualification. It's quite common for merchant banks to share clients with each other, and so we should be thinking about these merchant bank kind of client relationships in a more nuanced way, and trying to understand how the forms of these relationships varied even within a specific merchant bank and why that was the case. I'm going to argue that client sharing was frequent, and indeed that client sharing relates to sort of personal or community ties between merchant banks, and because it relates to these kind of personal ties, we would probably think of it as the outcome of some sort of collaborative rather than competitive process. Now, for a little bit of kind of historical context, so like I said, the bill of exchange is sort of the kind of the standard short-term debt instrument that we're thinking about here, and its primary use was in trade credit, where it acted as a sort of promissory note, like promising payment to the holder of the bill on a specific date. And in a kind of typical bill of exchange network, we have three main parties, which are the drawer, the acceptor, and the discounter. And so I've given you kind of a quick kind of example of what one of those networks might look like here, though there's actually kind of a great deal of variety in exactly how these are structured. But the important part here is what we have is basically the drawer is drawing a bill on the acceptor, who is then discounting that bill with a discounter and remitting those funds down to the drawer, who in this case is an exporter, who can then send their goods over to the importer, who on maturity will sort of kind of make good on that bill and remit funds to the acceptor, who will then pay whoever the holder of that bill is. And the important part here is that the ultimate lender in this network is obviously this discounter, though obviously there might be various discounters who are selling these bills amongst each other. But the ultimate borrower here is this exporter, about whom the discounter has has no information, right? And so the idea here is that the acceptor, because they become liable for that bill when they accept it, is effectively giving some sort of reputational guarantee for the bill. The discounter no longer needs to know anything about the underlying transaction or about the parties to that transaction, as long as they believe that the acceptor is able to make good on their promise to repay the bill. And what this means is that we can kind of have this highly liquid instrument which is kind of made possible because the acceptor is the one who is able to produce information about the borrower without the discounters having to worry about this. And in this period, the kind of premier acceptors are the merchant banks. By 1914, they are responsible for about 70% of acceptances, and they're considered as kind of the highest class, the first class bills, those accepted by these merchant banks, which are seen as basically kind of cash equivalents. The reason why these merchant banks are in a particularly advantageous position to produce that information is because they almost all from any of the kind of histories I know of these firms have their roots in kind of overseas merchant communities. Now, there are kind of two separate literatures which I want to speak to here. One is about the extent of competition within the merchant banking sector during the Edwardian period. And so typically, this is viewed as primarily a period of kind of continuity and consecration in the sector. There's this idea from particularly Cassis and Kyaniston of competition within limits between these merchant banks. They were aware of each other's sort of territorial bounds and were careful not to infringe upon those bounds. They were willing to aid each other in periods of crisis, and perhaps more importantly, what Cassis emphasizes is that these kind of formed a quite cohesive community, centered around kind of directorship at the Bank of England, but also formed through having kind of a shared educational background, from marrying into similar families, from going to the same social clubs and things like that. Now, on the other hand, Chapman has emphasized the sort of more competitive dynamic part of this sector by focusing on this newer wave of kind of mostly Germanic merchant banks arriving from the 1850s onwards. So banks like Kleinwaltz and Schroders, which he argues were more kind of representative of merchant banking because they were, well, the largest acceptors in this period, and by far the most successful and by far the fastest growing merchant banks in this period. So the disagreement is not so much about whether a specific merchant bank was or wasn't dynamic, but about whether these newer kind of immigrant merchant banks were more representative of the sector than these older anglicized firms. And overall, there's actually quite a great deal of consensus about this dichotomy between the kind of more stagnant kind of aristocratic class of merchant banks and the more dynamic Germanic periphery. Now, the other literature that I want to speak to is about kind of relationship banking in merchant banking. So relationship banking is this idea that you have a financial intermediary investing in client-specific information, where that information is can only really be generated through repeated interactions with that client. It goes beyond what is publicly available about that client, and perhaps most importantly, that information is sort of soft information. It's not easily transferred between different banks. And the reason why this is important is because it gives strong incentives for banks to invest in information production. They pay a fixed cost at the beginning of that relationship in the expectation of long-run returns to the relationship, where the client is sort of informationally captured by that bank. And then on the other side of the equation, it's important for borrowers to communicate their creditworthiness because they don't have easy access to capital from other sources. Now, Acminotti, Lucena Picaro, and Ugolini have applied this framework to look at merchant banking during the kind of acceptance market more generally during the first globalization. And what they're arguing is that the kind of distribution of relationships between acceptors and drawers and between acceptors and discounters is such that there's kind of a bias towards acceptor-discounter relationships. And what this means is that acceptors are in some ways resolving these information asymmetries, and this is evidenced by the fact that the drawers, the borrowers in that network, are able to access capital from kind of a great variety of lenders, discounters, right? And yet it isn't clear that kind of the efficiency with which this is taking place, right? The extent to which this is not producing redundant information. And when we look at some of the more historical evidence, there are kind of signs there is maybe more kind of collaboration between merchant banks than would be suggested by this relationship banking framework. If we look at, for instance, the underwriting market, we can see that by the kind of 1880s and 1890s, many of these kind of formally competitive merchant banks are beginning to be involved in the same syndicates as each other. And so that's quite a kind of formalized type of collaboration. And here we're probably thinking about something much more informal, but we can see kind of anecdotal evidence for that too. If we look at Chapman's seminal work on the foundation of merchant banking, he kind of discusses a number of different clients for those merchant banks, and all of them have at least 3 merchant banks through which they are transacting, and they actually have relatively large firms, right, in comparison to the merchant banks who they're having accept their bills. And so there are a few different reasons why we might think this might be the case. There could be kind of difficulties in scaling up information production or relationship formation on smaller firms outside the area, kind of cultural specialization of a particular merchant bank. And it could just be that there are large credit-worthy firms, and that a single merchant bank doesn't want to take on all the risk associated with that firm. And in that regard, there's this quote from Alexander Kleinwort, the founder of Kleinwort's bank, one of the founders, which I think is quite illuminating, which is, we would at all times rather increase our number of correspondents than our transactions with a few of them. And I think that's quite an important thing to keep in mind, because what it's showing is that actually they prefer having kind of a more distributed set of clients with whom they have weak ties, rather than a few clients which they have strong ties with, which is what we kind of expect from the relationship banking model. So what I'm going to do for this paper is use a few different sources to construct different types of network and to try and examine the overlap between those networks. And in particular, what I want to do is to think about the extent to which sharing clients between those merchant banks is related to having personal connections between those merchant banks. So the kind of foundational source that I use to gather my sample for this is Thomas Skinner's The London Banks, which is a kind of business directory running from the 1860s to, I think, 1916. And what this contains is details on all the different banks in London. So the name of the bank, the partners, directors, managers, paid up capital if they're joint stocks, and things like that. So from this, what I do is I take the kind of 74 merchant banks that are listed there, which contain 232 different partners, and then I'm going to kind of compare those banks and the partners at those banks in a variety of different kind of social and professional contexts. So the first one, the kind of other type of network that I gather is this network on bank co-directorship. So it's never the case that partners of merchant banks are partners at multiple merchant banks, but it is the case that partners at merchant banks often have directorships at other banks. So if we take a merchant bank A and a merchant bank B, they won't share any partners, but the partners of those two banks might well share a directorship at a third non-merchant bank. So the network that I construct here is of shared directorships of merchant bankers at those non-merchant banks. And so from the London banks, I gather information about 176 other banks listed there, and a further 955 partners. Then the kind of next thing I want to look at is kind of the extent to which client sharing is related to social or kind of long-standing professional ties. And to do this, I gather information on merchant bankers from two different sets of kind of biographical dictionaries. So the first of these is Henry Bassett's Men of Note in Finance and Commerce, which was intended to be a sort of representative overview in the style of who's who, but for the financial sector. So it would draw information from newspapers, from professional bodies, from interviews with the individuals concerned in the biographies. And so, yeah, that's the first source I use. And then the second one is I look for the names of all of the partners listed in the London banks in Who's Who, and again, gather kind of similar information. So from Men of Note, I gather information on 97 partners, and Who's Who, I gather it on 73 partners. And so the type of information this gives, so this is an example here from Men of Note, kind of name, titles, place of birth, date of birth, educational history, career history, club memberships, residences, things like that. And from this, I construct two separate networks. One is kind of a general co-directorship network, so not just focused on the financial sector, but checking whether partners at Merchant Bank A and Merchant Bank B have a shared directorship at, for instance, the Sunderland Shipbuilding Co. And so that would be a link in that network. And then the third type of network that I create is shared club memberships between the merchant banks. So do partners at Merchant Bank A and B both have membership at, for instance, the Reform Club? And then finally, the final source I use is this database of kind of the Bank of England discount ledgers from the paper by Acquaminotti, Lucena Pirro, and Ugolini. And so basically this tracks the details of all the bills of exchange discounted by the Bank of England in 1906, which is, I think, 24,000 bills. And so this contains basically information on the drawer, the acceptor, and the discounters of those bills. And so what I just want to know is what is the relationship between the drawer and the acceptor? So how often are acceptors sharing drawers with each other? So we can think about the structure of this network as looking something like this. So for instance, if we look at the shared drawer network, what we want to know is, so merchant bank A, if they share 5 drawers with merchant bank B, then we create a network where those two things have an edge with weight 5 on it. Now, there are a few different ways that we can construct the kind of social network, the kind of personal network ties. So we can construct it either just saying, do they have any sort of relation in between these two merchant banks? And so here, for instance, this is the business network. We see that, yes, indeed, those two merchant banks are connected through a co-directorship, so we just give them a weight of 1. The second way of doing this would be to count the number of shared kind of institutions between them. So here, these two merchant banks kind of share directorships at Sun Life Insurance Society and the Northern Assurance Co. So that would give a weight of 2. We could count the number of shared memberships at these institutions. So here we have William H.N. Goshen, who shares a membership with Cecil Chaplin. We have William H. Goshen, who shares a membership with Cecil Chaplin. And we have Alexander H. Goshen, who shares a membership with Henry J. Lubbock. So that would give a weight of 3. So I've tried the kind of following results with all of those different weighting methods, and they give very similar results. The method that I'm going to show you is using the kind of institutional weighting, so counting the number of shared businesses between them or shared clubs, because I think this is probably the most analogous to the shared drawer network. So the first, the kind of first thing we want to look at is the extent to which relationship banking as a model kind of holds up. And so the kind of extreme of pure relationship banking would be each drawer has 1 acceptor. At the other extreme, we would say that if this is kind of purely transactional, then for each bill, they could have a different acceptor, and that would be on average having 4.86 acceptors. In reality, what we see is something between these two extremes. So on average, drawers have 2.83 acceptors. And so what this is suggesting to us is that there is some sort of relationship between borrowers and acceptors, right? They're not just selecting these things at random, but at the same time, it's not the case that acceptors are conveying unique information or unique borrowers to the market. And I think this view is perhaps even more apparent if we look from the kind of perspective of the acceptor. So if we look at that perspective, we see that 88% of merchant bankers are sharing drawers with other acceptors, and on average more than half, so 52.9% of the drawers of those merchant banks are actually shared with other acceptors. And I think it's perhaps particularly interesting to note that this doesn't kind of fall along the lines of that aristocratic versus kind of newer immigrant dichotomy that is given in the literature. We actually see that client sharing permeates the sector pretty broadly and is equally prevalent amongst the newer and older generation of merchant banks. The main thing that I want to talk about then is why do we see client sharing? Like, what type of process is this the outcome of? And so what we really want to know here is having a shared client between, or shared drawer between these merchant banks related to the kind of social or kind of professional proximity between those merchant banks. So if a specific merchant bank A shares 5 drawers, is that related to it also sharing 5 clubs with merchant bank B? And so the way that I look at this is I take the kind of weighted adjacency matrix for each of the different networks and check the correlation between them. And so here I've got a very kind of simplified example of how that works. So here on the left, we have a drawer network with just 3 banks. And what we can see here is bank A and B share 8 drawers, bank A and C share 2 drawers, and bank B and C share 4 drawers. On the right, I have an example of what a club network might look like. So here, bank A and B share 4 clubs, bank A and C share 1 club, and banks B and C share 2 clubs. So then what I do is I take the matching elements from each of these matrices and check the correlation between them, which here would give us a value of 1, right? So what does this look like when we look at the real data? So when we look at the kind of the observed correlations here, we actually see that there's a quite substantial, kind of very high correlation between these networks and these kind of personal networks and client sharing networks. So the values we have, so The bank co-directorship network is correlated at 0.21, the general co-directorship network at 0.14, and the club network at 0.1. Now, I understand these are probably a little bit hard to wrap your head around. So if we think about these in raw terms, then that will perhaps, kind of help you grasp the scale a little bit better. So what this means is that an increase of having one shared bank directorship between two merchant banks is related to having 3.2 more shared clients between those banks. Similarly, a shared directorship of any type is related, one shared directorship that is related to an increase of 0.64 shared clients and a shared club membership, like one increase in shared club memberships is related to a shared drawer increase of 0.38. Now, these are all relatively large figures, but particularly the bank co-directorship figure is very large, considering that the median number of shared drawers in this network is only 7. So we might think that this, though, is the outcome of sort of the demographic characteristics of these networks, or the sampling process, or the popularity of or kind of prominence of certain merchant banks. If a merchant bank is prominent because it accepts a lot of bills and prominent because they have memberships a lot of club, maybe these things just naturally overlap with each other. And so what I try and do is to generate 2 different sets of simulations which try and simulate those characteristics without the sort of social processes that would lead to these results, right? So and then compare the correlations that we see between these simulated networks and our observed ones. And what we see is that the correlation in the observed networks is much, much higher than those simulated benchmarks, where basically I either just assign the ties randomly to each other, or what I do is I assign the ties semi-randomly in such a way that I keep the number of ties each bank has held constant. And by keeping the number of ties each bank has constant, what we're trying to do here is control for the fact that this might just be kind of correlation between the prestige of different banks. And what we can see is, even accounting for those factors, the correlation would not be nearly as high as we see in these actual kind of the observed networks. So there are kind of actually, yeah. So there are kind of a few different things we might want to think about here. So one is, why do we see this variety in relationship forms, right? So why is it the case that these banks are kind of sharing maybe around half their clients, but not the other half? And I think we can get some insights here from doing sort of more micro level work. So a lot of my recent work has been with Olivier Acqueminotti, looking at the clients of Kleinvolt's merchant bank. And what we see there is that the nature of the relationship depended heavily on the extent to which Kleinvolt's had a sort of cultural specialization in that area. So in Germany, where they had a far greater number of kind of long-standing local connections, we see very small clients who are very geographically dispersed. On the other hand, in places like North America and East Asia, what we see is they engage with much larger institutional clients. And what I would imagine, though maybe you have kind of ideas here of how to test this better, is that those larger institutional clients are the ones that we're seeing being shared between merchant banks. And so, yeah, this might be because there are kind of, diseconomies of scale in terms of establishing those types of relationship, and because it's just very hard for these merchant banks to get robust information about smaller borrowers without extensive kind of cultural ties in a region, or kind of personal relations in a region. In terms of mechanisms, so I'm not arguing that this is necessarily a causal mechanism, and clearly there's work to be done on identifying exactly what the mechanism is. But from the sociology literature, we would probably think that there's kind of a quite strong relationship between being part of the same group and kind of trust within groups, right? And so there are a bunch of different informal mechanisms which we might think are responsible for information sharing here. One of them is that members of a group are simply less private about sensitive information when sort of engaging with each other. Another, and this is probably kind of the channel that I'm leaning towards more, is that by being aware of the clients of those who are more kind of socially proximate. This could help reduce search costs. So yeah, if members of two merchant banks are talking to each other more generally, and even if they're not being kind of specific with detailed information about those borrowers, simply awareness that those are the greater awareness that those are the borrowers engaging with kind of those merchant banks might be giving off some information about them. And then the other one is that it might be the case that more socially proximate merchant banks are likely to engage with agents who are more socially proximate or who belong to sort of the same overseas communities. And that could mean that those agents are sort of pulling from the same pool of information. So in terms of thinking about what the implications of this might be, I think there's some kind of interesting insights we can draw kind of from the more experimental literature here. So there's this paper by Han and Yang from 2013, which looks at, in a kind of experimental setup, the extent to which agents are likely to share information, or sorry, to invest in information production about the quality of like of an unknown asset, if they're able to communicate with each other about the information they've collected. And they find that those information production activities go down substantially when agents are able to communicate about them with each other. And if something similar is going on here, we would expect that we might have some sort of kind of free rider issues developing, and that this could give a kind of false sense of security as to the risk associated with those clients, and particularly with those kind of larger institutional clients. Further, it could give very limited incentives for merchant banks to try and produce information or to kind of establish relationships in communities which they don't have a strong engagement with, right? If they're able to easily learn about those borrowers in those regions through this sort of collaborative process, then they don't have to kind of set up those types of information producing facilities there, which means they're much less likely to learn about smaller firms in those regions. What are the kind of central conclusions that I want to take away? So I think the kind of what this is showing so far to me is that the idea that relationship banking applies in a kind of purer sense here is clearly not the case. Client sharing is frequent and kind of prominent across the sector. And not only that, it's clearly related in some ways to some sort of collaboration or kind of personal ties between merchant banks, shared financial interests, shared social ties, and that this means that probably there is kind of redundant information being produced, or kind of an over-reliance on the information of other merchant banks. In terms of the next steps that I kind of want to take with this project, so one of them is to try and investigate this link further between the size of drawers and whether they're likely to have multiple acceptors. The other is to try and think about if we have some sort of kind of rate setting going on here. So for some of the clients, I've been able to identify them in the kind of books of both Barings and Kleinwaltz and other merchant banks, and to try and see if the rates that they set kind of match each other and kind of keep pace with each other, or whether they're kind of competing over having lower commissions than each other. And then the other thing that would be useful to, I think, is to try and identify more clearly what these communities are, right? Can I say that we have this cluster of merchant banks that all are kind of sharing and collaborating with each other? Or is it a kind of much more dispersed and kind of informal model where kind of little pieces of information are flowing between all these different merchant banks? So yeah, that's everything. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Aurelius, for your presentation. So now we will open the floor for discussion and for the Q&A. So if anyone has any questions and want to raise their hands, we invite you to open your microphones and your videos if possible. If not, I can ask the questions myself. I'll start with Srita Banerjee, and had a question on the chat. I think it was more on a clarification note. So Srita, if you want to ask your question yourself, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sergio. Thank you, Aurelius. Great, fascinating presentation. As already was mentioned, it's a clarification question. This term or the categorization of informal, formal, do you find it in the archive? How do these merchant bankers self-identify vis-a-vis joint stock bankers? And or is it something, is this categorization sort of more a secondary literature thing? I ask because I look at banking in colonial India, and this is definitely something the colonial government is trying to do very actively, categorize informal and formal bankers and financiers. Thanks.
So yeah, so essentially, the merchant, what I'm considering here to be merchant banks would initially have been considered to be just simply merchant firms who were to some degree involved in financing. So if we look at sort of the earlier versions of these directories, they tend not to show up at all, or to be classified as merchants, because often they start out kind of providing these like financing facilities to the counterparties in trades they are directly engaged in, and it's only kind of from the second half, well no, it's kind of during the 19th century that they developed this more purely financial role. In terms of how they're classified in the archives, so basically you would see that before the 1880s, they are not considered within these banking directories at all, because they're considered as merchant firms. In the 1890s, they begin to show up as merchants, and then it's only really from kind of the 1900s onwards that they are distinctly classified in these archives as merchant banks. So I think in response, like, they're always seen as quite a distinct class of bank from joint stocks or commercial, because they come from this quite different kind of historical background as basically merchant firms.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's continue with Mary Bridges. Mary, if you want to ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. This paper is fascinating. I love the intricate work on relationships. I do research about the creation of the acceptance market in the United States, and I'm dying to know how lucrative is this? Are the merchant banks in particular? I'm just kind of wondering about their incentives and like how big are the profits that they're turning around from accepting, and whether acceptance kind of is linked to other types of businesses, to revenue generation. So if you could just talk a little bit about how banks are making the money here, that would be great.
Yeah, so it depends quite heavily on the particular merchant bank in terms of, so the newer merchant banks, so particularly banks like Schroders and Kleinworts, tend to be involved almost entirely just in the acceptance market, whereas the older ones are also involved much more heavily in underwriting. So how it would work is basically in terms of where they're generating their profit, is the merchant bank would have some sort of fixed commission for the acceptance of a bill that they would charge to the drawer of that bill effectively. And so that commission would depend on a number of different things, such as whether there's collateral offered for the bill, the kind of expected maturity of the bill, and things like that. So in terms of like the types of clients that they're generating profits from, so the only bank that really has very substantial records on these operations that still exist is Kleinworts, and what we see is about maybe half of the volume of acceptances that we see in their archives are coming from sort of permanent clients who hold an acceptance account with fixed rates, and the rest of it is coming from these sort of one-off transactional relationships. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if that's fully answered your question. Do you want to maybe direct me a little bit more if that doesn't help?
Yeah, I mean, I was just wondering, like, are they, is there the idea that kind of getting one of these as a permanent client, there's some sort of aspirational aspect to providing, to doing acceptance services, or is the commission kind of Like, are they trying to undercut each other or use this as an entry point to get more kinds of business? Is the spirit of the question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would say often no. Well, it's hard to know because there are relatively limited surviving records where we can kind of match clients between different acceptors and things like that. It often is the case that clients, I mean, the vast majority of accounts that I've seen for these clients would be purely, those clients would only engage in acceptance operations, and even over sort of a 40-year period would never engage in any other type of operation with the merchant bank. But yeah, yeah. And in terms of like whether they're competing over rates, I would love to know, but it's almost impossible to tell because there's only really 2 or maybe 3 banks which keep records of the rates at a client level for the 19th century, and so I'm still kind of working on that, and will let you know if I figure that out at some point.
Okay, thank you. We have one question in the chat by William Allen. I don't know, William, do you want to open your mic and camera and ask yourself, or should I?
I've done it, thank you. My question is this, that it occurs to me that one reason for information sharing would be that you might easily have a borrower or a bill drawer who wanted more money than an individual merchant bank would want to lend within its risk limits, so that in order to accommodate the borrower, it would bring in other banks that it had a good relationship with and share out the risks among them. And if that was a significant motivation, then I guess you would find that the drawers that borrowed more money tended to have more acceptors. So my question is, do you think that that's a serious contender, and have you looked at the evidence? But thank you very much anyway for the presentation, which I think is fascinating.
Absolutely. Like, so I also suspect that is one of the main channels through which this process is taking place. I think so. It can be very, yeah. So I think that's sort of the next stage that I want to the next stage of the project for me is to try and gather more information about those drawers, and to try and see whether this is indeed related to either to the size of those drawers or to the kind of lack of cultural specialization of the merchant bank in that area. Again, the problem is we only have kind of surviving client information for 1 or maybe 2 merchant banks, but I will try and do that where possible. But yeah, I think that probably is what's going on here. But yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I also just want to say that I'm very glad to see people from our network joining frequently in our presentations. We had, well, just Mary asked a question. She's in our upcoming line of presenters. And now I want to give the turn to John Handel, who has already presented here in our series as well, to ask your question. Nice to see you again, by the way.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't make it to my office in time, so I'm like masked up in the middle of a hallway in a random building on campus. So I thought this was a great presentation, and I was really convinced by the empirical research that you put forward here. My question was, and this is both kind of a stylistic question and also hopefully like a bigger question about the literature, but you open by talking about London as a financial center in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but then you never really returned to that. And so I'm curious. So one, that's just something that I think you should think about when submitting this paper. But the question that leads me to is that there's a set of literature here that you don't really seem to engage, but does seem to have a bearing on this, which is the literature on gentlemanly capitalism. I mean, you cite King Yeston, and we can debate, whether or not gentlemanly capitalism is a good framework, but I think there is something to say about, the social thickness of relationships within financial centers that makes them that is characteristic of financial centers as such, where something like you were describing, wouldn't be too surprising coming out of that milieu. So I guess I'm trying to, I want to press you more specifically on how you see your research kind of intervening in these debates around financial centers and or generally capitalism, the social classes that constitute them. Thanks.
Yeah. So, okay, so yeah, so like my thesis actually more generally is actually like very largely focused on this idea of gentlemanly capitalism. And so I think there's some interesting, I think the interesting things to know here, so because the first, this is the second paper in my thesis, the first one basically looks at the extent to which these merchant bankers were kind of members of those clubs and whether they interacted with politicians and aristocrats in those clubs and things like that. But so I think the interesting thing here and in that paper is that this typical distinction that we see in that literature between the kind of gentlemanly aristocratic class of merchant bankers doesn't really seem to show up in the data. So it's difficult to say what's going on. What I think might be going on, right, is that there is, the argument that I would like to make is sort of that there is this global financial elite to an extent who have quite transferable social capital. And it's not the case that merchant bankers are not prominent in these clubs. They are, but there's no significant transformation to their prominence throughout this period, and that actually kind of crosses what these kind of national identity or kind of culture group lines that we would typically think of separating those different groups, or at least the kind of Cassis or Kane and Hopkins would suggest to separate those groups. But yeah, no, I definitely should talk more about that, and that's a good point.
Thank you, John, for your question. And now, Paula, we have Paula Bedovelli. Paula, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sergio and Aurelius, for a great presentation. So I have a couple questions. So I understand from what you presented to us in the great paper you shared with us, that the idea that the merchant bankers shared some personal ties created some incentives for them to share information amongst themselves, right? So that doesn't, but that doesn't actually tell us a lot about the quality of this information that they share, right? So I'm bringing here the idea of information and noise, and whether or not they are sharing partial information, because on one hand, you have a system where it's very expensive, it's very even mysterious how they are acquiring. It's slow to acquire this information because it's mostly through repeated interactions, mistakes that are made, information that comes from different channels. So I also think that they have an incentive to keep part of that information to themselves, right? So in this sense, even though it's very intuitive that these personal ties are allowing them or creating incentives, be that social, political, or even business incentives for them to share information, we don't actually know what is the quality or the strategies in sharing this information, right? And in that way, I think that a great reference for you is Monica Paul Fraser, who has done some work on risk management techniques employed by French and German bankers in the 19th century. And the title is even like Information Noise, something like that. And she shows that, yeah, they face these incentives, but sometimes the bankers also kind of faced incentives to create noise because they share very little information on a business partner, a drawer, etc., just to respond to the obligation of sharing something. So this is one of this. I think that's one of the things you may want to consider, right? The other is what I was thinking when I was reading your paper is whether your paper answers why we don't have in the UK, in England, something like the Bradsheet and Dunn Company, right? A mercantile rating agency that is basically its business is selling information to the public. So why we don't have something like that in England, in the UK, it's because the system is working, but when does the system stops working? Because apparently it's not very efficient when you come to areas where you have small business firms, or you don't have a lot of penetration by this great firm. So it surprises, it's kind of surprising that you don't see some sort of special service arising that produces information on this smaller business to connect, you know, these merchant bankers and, you know, places where they don't have cultural or ethnic or political penetration and connections. So these are some of the 2 questions I wanted to raise. I have more, but I want to open to colleagues. Thank you.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thanks, especially the one on the quality of information. I think the thing that's interesting here, though, right, is like, well, maybe in a kind of positive or negative way, is that we're not observing information sharing in any direct sense, right? Like, if we're observing something, it's the extent to which this information sharing leads to changes in business decisions, and the extent to which we might expect information sharing from having social ties. So, like, if it is the case that there's noise being created, it's still the case that this noise is leading to different actions by those merchant banks, and that's. But no, those are both really helpful, and I'll definitely, yeah, look into them. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paula. We have another question here in the chat by Colin Lewis. Colin, I don't know if you want to open your mic and camera, if possible, or I can read your question otherwise. Well, I think I'll just read the question. So Colin says here on the chat, a question about regional specialization. To what was there a greater, lesser tendency towards client sharing in terms of areas in which a bank specialized?
Oh, wait, sorry, can you repeat it?
Yeah, so it says, to what extent, I think, was there a greater or lesser tendency towards client sharing in terms of areas in which a bank specialized?
The basic answer is I'm not sure. So that's one of the things I've been building up recently, is to try and get a kind of nice variable that covers the regional specialization of all of these 74 merchant banks, and to try and see if there are kind of distinctions between those who specialize in different regions, but I don't know right now, sorry.
I can perhaps add an additional point to that question, and I was also wondering, if you have information, can you extrapolate information on how these co-opetition worked? So in which terms banks decided to what extent and how, what kind of information would they share, and how would they compete in other things? It was just hiding, like keeping information private? Was there sort of tacit agreement, explicit conversations or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm kind of thinking here that that any information share, like, so there's no formal arrangements that I've ever seen between these banks to share information on acceptance clients. So the extent to which information sharing is occurring would be informal, and the best you can track it is basically to know, okay, did this particular partner have a meeting with this other partner, and what might they have discussed at that meeting? So it's difficult to get an exhaustive sense of how this might have taken place. Yeah, so like I said, I think, like, if it is occurring, it's more to do with kind of drawing on similar pools of information. So we might not even think that they're directly communicating information with each other. It might be the case, you know, that being in a certain social club means that members of that club are talking about similar things and therefore distributing this information. So it might not be such a direct tie even, right? All that it means is that that banks are who are drawing from shared social professional pools are to a degree sharing clients with each other. And so this effect is stronger with more personal relationships. So the most personal relationship we have is probably these bank co-directorships, where you'd think that these people actually probably know each other reasonably well. But so yeah, like as that relationship gets more direct, the extent of information sharing probably increases, but that's not to say that information sharing always has to be so formalized or direct, right?
Yeah, because I was thinking this in terms of the London clearing banks and the cartel and how they used to run things was something similar, although with some other more formal arrangements. So perhaps in your case that might be a bit different. And I was thinking, well, to that extent might be helpful. I don't know to which extent, but having a look at the British Bankers Association archives in terms of seeing if they had any sort of relation with them, or maybe some conversation might arise within those archives. That might be helpful.
Okay.
Next we have, and forgive me, I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Ativa Pertilla. If you want to ask your question.
Hi, thanks so much for a fascinating presentation and clearly a prodigious amount of research. So I am coming from an American financial history perspective, and so I'm curious, for one thing, kind of following up on Paula Vedovali's question about whether you've looked at whether there was some kind of professionalization of information gathering going on. And I don't know if you're familiar with Naomi Lamoureux's book, Insider Lending, but that basically looks at the development of basically internal credit investigation departments. She's looking more at, I guess, incorporated banks rather than, or which I guess are kind of equivalent to more like joint stock banks rather than merchant banks. But I imagine that there might have been, similar questions or, similar problem solving going on within, the larger merchant banks that you're looking at in London. And then I guess another question I have is whether one possible topic for investigation is to look at, whether these networks are, one way to answer to look at, what exactly does this network mean now that you've developed it, might be, a couple of questions I've asked about, was there like kind of a regional specialization, or, was there like a industrial sector specialization such as textiles or something like that. But then another way to look at it might be in terms of, ethnic or, or looking at it on the banker side rather than the client side. So for example, like if you know of Susie Pack's book, Gentlemen Bankers, which looks at Wall Street in the late 19th, early 20th century, and looks at the ways that basically Jewish firms and firms run by Jewish bankers and firms run by Christian bankers didn't have social relationships, but they did have business relationships. So I don't know if that might just be an interesting question to kind of to look at. Do you see that that there are like I know there's the Rothschilds, and I'm sure there are other banks in the London database that may not have had social ties, but did that mean that they were not able to collaborate with other firms? And then I guess the third thing I would just say is just I think maybe it just might be a little helpful to put in a little bit more just to explain like the scale of what you're talking about in the bank's business. Like you have one point where you mentioned, I guess the quote from Chapman on like page 8 about like the typical clients of banks. But I think it just might be useful to kind of say something about like, here's like the typical size or the range of size, just have like a table of like, here's the range of the size of acceptances that we're talking about here. And, if you have like the data from Kleinworts or another bank, just kind of saying, here's what proportion of acceptances was in, these merchant banks. It just might be a little bit more to kind of give people a grounding of how important these transactions were in the bank's activities. But thanks again so much.
Aurelius, let me interrupt for a second. Perhaps we can also add here Rory Miller's question. Rory, if you want to open your mic.
Yes, I was just wondering how provincial centres with clusters of specialised import-export merchants like Liverpool or Glasgow fit into this structure in London.
Thank you. Yeah, Aurelius, if you want to go ahead then with the questions.
So on the provincial kind of centers of trade, so what would often happen is that those import-export firms would be, so it's often not the case that the kind of exporters and importers involved in the bill of exchange transaction would be in the UK, but you do see quite frequently in the Kleinwort's books, kind of Liverpool firms, for instance, drawing bills for an import from India and things like that. So this is also connecting areas about which probably the merchant banks all had relatively equal access to information, or relatively good access to information, because a lot of firms, merchant banks, are engaged with clients in those areas. On the kind of the previous points, those are definitely, so in terms of formalization of ties, so again, like we don't really have any client level. The first client level data that we have is this project I'm working on with Olivier Ekmanotti, which isn't quite finished. So we can't really tell anything about the kind of characteristics of clients yet. We're working on getting there. But we can see that Kleinwort's, for instance, had very formal information production activities. They engage with a large number of agents and kind of correspondents whose role was purely to provide them with detailed information about different regions, different prospective clients. One really quick thing, I know I'm kind of overrunning, which is though that, so if we look, I don't know if you guys can see this at all well, which is, so Kleinwort's, for instance, who are kind of renowned for not having very strong social ties within the London banking community, do in fact have one of the kind of most strongly connected firms in terms of sharing drawers, and this is despite also having themselves very extensive formal information production activities. So it isn't just the case here that, like I said, we're seeing this as for the kind of aristocratic, well-connected class, but also for this kind of much more highly organized and formalized kind of information producing merchant banks.
Okay, thank you very much, Aurelius, for your fantastic paper and presentation. And just before we close, I want to take the opportunity to invite you again to subscribe to our YouTube channel and all our social networks, the webpage, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Also, I want to remind you of our next event, which will take place on December 13th. We will have Javier Mejia presenting his paper, Modernizing Elites in Latin America, Social Network Evidence from the Emergence of Banking in Antioquia. And you can find the link to register there, or in any of our social media. You'll see the posters in the coming days. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us again to a wonderful session, and to all the people who asked questions, and of course, Aurelius, for your presentation and your paper. We'll have to see you soon. Bye-bye.